The late afternoon sun slanted through the window of my study. Outside, Whitefish Creek was settling into evening the way it always did. Quiet, peaceful. The kind of peace a man earns after he's seen enough trouble to appreciate stillness. I was 68 years old that spring of 1895. My badge sat on the desk in front of me where I'd placed it the day I retired. 23 years I'd worn that star. 23 years of trying to figure out where the law ended and justice began. My visitor sat across from me, young fellow from back east, writing stories about the frontier. He'd heard the tales, he said, wanted to know about Miles Sutton, and the woman he bought off an auction block. Wanted to know if the legend was true. I poured us both 2 fingers of whiskey. Good whiskey, not the rot gut they used to serve in the camps. "You want to know about Miles Sutton?" I asked. "Folks have made it quite a story. Frontier romance, they call it now. Knight in dusty spurs rescuing the damsel, that sort of thing." The young man leaned forward, eager as a pup. I picked up my old badge, felt the weight of it in my palm. "I can tell you what really happened. I was there. I saw the whole thing unfold." I set the badge back down. But the truth was harder than any legend, messier, and more beautiful if you understand what beauty means out here. The young man's pencil hovered over his notebook. "It started in the summer of 1878, I said, "in a town called Redemption Creek, though there wasn't much redemption to be found there, not that day. The heat that July was the kind that made a man's shirt stick to his back before he'd even climbed onto his horse. I'd ridden down from Whitefish Creek on sheriff's business, collecting depositions for a land dispute. Redemption Creek wasn't my jurisdiction, but the plaintiff lived there and the defendant lived in mine, so I had to make the trip. It was a hard town, Redemption Creek. The kind of place that springs up around a silver strike and starts dying the moment the vein runs thin. By the summer of '78, the silver was nearly gone, and what was left was desperation. I could smell it in the air as I rode down the main street. Dust and decay. Cheap whiskey and cheaper dreams. The buildings leaned like tired men, painted peeled away in long curling strips, exposing gray wood beneath. Flies buzzed around the hitching posts where horses stood with their heads hanging low. Even the dogs moved slow, tongues lolling, seeking shade wherever they could find it. I'd planned to conduct my business and leave before sundown, get back to Whitefish Creek where the air was cleaner and the people were halfway decent. But as I approached the center of town, I saw a crowd gathering near the bank. That should have been my first warning. Nothing good ever came from a crowd in a place like Redemption Creek. I guided my horse closer. Folks were pressed together in a loose half-circle, their attention fixed on a makeshift platform someone had erected in the street. Just rough pine boards nailed together and propped up on barrels, the kind of thing you'd use for a speech or a hanging or an auction. A man stood on the platform, well dressed by Redemption Creek standards. Suit jacket despite the heat, derby hat, watch chain glinting across his vest. I recognized him even from a distance. Silas Turner, the banker, a man with soft hands and hard eyes. But it wasn't Turner that made my stomach turn cold. It was the woman standing beside him. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, slender but not frail. She wore a calico dress that had been mended more than once and a bonnet that couldn't hide the chestnut hair falling loose around her face. She held a baby against her chest, clutching the child like he was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. Her eyes were what I noticed most. Green eyes, bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too. Defiance, pride. The kind of dignity that doesn't break easy even when everything else has. The baby fussed in her arms, 6 months old maybe, too young to understand but old enough to sense his mother's fear. I dismounted and pushed my way through the crowd, close enough to hear Turner's voice ringing out over the assembled men. And they were mostly men, I noticed. Miners with dirt under their fingernails, ranchers in from the hard scrabble spreads outside town, A few townsfolk, shopkeepers, and clerks, the kind who came to watch spectacle the way other folks might watch a dogfight. "Gentlemen," Turner was saying, his voice smooth as oil on water, "as executor of the late Patrick Flynn's estate, it falls to me to settle his considerable debts." He gestured to the woman beside him like she was a piece of furniture he was describing for potential buyers. "Before you stands his widow, Margaret Flynn, and her child. Strong woman, as you can see. Good for cooking, cleaning, and whatever else a man might need around his place." The way he said it made my skin crawl. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Margaret Flynn's chin lifted slightly. She didn't look at the crowd. Kept her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, like if she looked hard enough, she might see a way out of this nightmare. "How much did Flynn owe?" someone called from the crowd. Turner smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. $120. A significant sum, to be sure, but consider what you're getting. A young woman in her prime, a hard worker, I'm told, and the child, of course. He said it casual, like he was selling a horse with a colt thrown in for good measure. The baby started crying in earnest now. Margaret bounced him gently, whispering words I couldn't hear. Her hands were shaking. I looked around the crowd, searching for someone else who might object to this obscenity, but I saw only calculation in most of their faces. A few looked away, uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to speak up, and some, God help us, looked eager. A big man near the front, dirty canvas pants and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months, called out, "Can we see her teeth?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ugly laughter. Margaret Flynn's face went pale, but she didn't move, didn't give them the satisfaction. Turner held up his hands. "Gentlemen, please, let's maintain some decorum. This is a legal proceeding, after all. Legal." The word tasted like ashes in my mouth. I wanted to stop it. Every instinct I had screamed at me to climb up on that platform and put an end to this horror. But Redemption Creek wasn't my jurisdiction. I had no authority here. The law, such as it was, belonged to the town marshal, and I could see him standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching with the same dead-eyed indifference he'd probably bring to watching paint dry. So I stood there, a witness to something I couldn't stop, and hated myself for it. "Bidding will start at $50, Turner announced. "Do I hear 50? Silence stretched out, long enough that I allowed myself a thin hope that maybe, just maybe, these men had enough decency left in them to refuse. Then a voice called out, $50, an old rancher, lean as a whip, with eyes that assessed Margaret Flynn the way he'd assess livestock. $50, Turner confirmed. "Do I hear 60? 60, another voice said. This one from a miner, younger, with the red-rimmed eyes of a man who spent his nights in the bottom of a bottle. The bidding climbed. 70, 75. Each number another nail in Margaret Flynn's coffin of humiliation. At $85, the bidding paused. The high bidder was a man I recognized, though I wished I didn't. Jack Malone, though everyone called him Big Jack. He ran a brothel on the edge of town, and his reputation was ugly even by Redemption Creek standards. Big Jack stood near the front of the crowd, massive arms crossed over his barrel chest. He had a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight he'd won years ago. The other man hadn't been so lucky. 85, Big Jack said again, his voice carrying a note of finality, like he'd decided the bidding was over. Turner looked around the crowd. $85, going once. Do I hear 90? Silence. Margaret Flynn's shoulders sagged slightly. Not defeat, exactly. More like the body's acknowledgement of what the mind already knew, that this was happening, that in a few moments she and her baby would belong to Jack Malone, and God only knew what that would mean for them. I saw her lips moving. A prayer, maybe. Or maybe she was talking to the baby, promising him something she hoped she could keep. Turner raised his hand, ready to bring it down and seal the deal. 85, going twice. That's when I heard the horse. The sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, moving fast. The crowd turned as one, craning to see who was fool enough to ride through town at that speed in this heat. The rider came into view at the far end of the street, emerging from the shimmering heat haze like something out of a fever dream. A buckskin stallion, dark with sweat, and on its back a man who rode like he'd been born in the saddle. Even from a distance, even before I could see his face clearly, something about him seemed familiar. He slowed as he approached the crowd, the horse's sides heaving. 3 days of hard riding, I'd learn later. 3 days with barely any rest, because a man in a saloon in Billings had mentioned an auction in Redemption Creek, mentioned the name Flynn, and this rider had turned his horse south without a second thought. The crowd parted to let him through. Something about the way he sat his horse, the quiet authority in his bearing, made men step aside without being asked. He was tall, I could see that much. Broad-shouldered but lean, the kind of build you get from hard work rather than soft living. Dark brown hair showing silver at the temples despite his relative youth. Maybe 30, 32 at most. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved with lines that spoke of things seen and endured. But it was his eyes that I noticed most. Blue as a high country lake and just as cold. He wore trail clothes, dusty and worn. A gun belt rode low on his hip, the holster tied down in a way that told me he knew how to use it. But his hands rested easy on the saddle horn, not threatening. Not yet. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, those blue eyes taking in the scene, the platform, Turner, Margaret Flynn and her baby, the assembled men with their calculating expressions. I watched his jaw tighten. Then, quiet but clear as a church bell, he spoke. $100. The crowd went still. Even the baby stopped crying, like he sensed something had shifted in the air. Turner's head snapped toward the rider. "I beg your pardon." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, left his horse ground-tied and walked toward the platform, each boot fall deliberate in the sudden silence. Dust rose with each step and hung in the heavy air. $100, he repeated. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much in recent days, or years. Turner's eyes narrowed. "Sir, the current bid stands at 85, and I don't believe I know you." "Name's Miles Sutton." He said it plain, no explanation offered. That's when I recognized him. Miles Sutton from up near Whitefish Creek. Kept a small ranch in the foothills, ran some cattle, broke horses for sale. A quiet man, the kind who came to town maybe twice a year and never stayed long. I'd spoken to him a handful of times, always found him respectful but distant, like he was holding himself separate from the world. What the hell was he doing here? Big Jack stepped forward, his face darkening. "I bid 85, that makes it my turn." Miles didn't even look at him, kept his eyes on Turner. $100, cash money. That more than cover the debt? Turner licked his lips. I could see him calculating. The debt was real enough, I didn't doubt that. Patrick Flynn had been a gambler and a drunk, from what I'd heard. But Turner was also a man who enjoyed power, and I suspected this auction was as much about humiliation as it was about collecting debt. "Well," Turner said slowly, "actually, the debt is $120. I may have rounded down for the sake of the bidding." A lie. I could see it in his face. But what could I do? Call him out in front of everyone? Start a confrontation I had no authority to finish? Miles reached into his vest pocket, drew out a small leather pouch. He climbed the steps to the platform, each board creaking under his weight, and poured the contents onto the rough pine surface. Gold coins. They clinked and rolled, catching the late afternoon sun. "Count it," Miles said. Turner did, his soft fingers sorting through the coins. His expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something else. Disappointment, maybe. He'd been hoping Miles wouldn't have enough, hoping to drag this out, to wring more entertainment from Margaret Flynn's suffering. $120, Turner admitted, though it clearly pained him. That covers the debt, yes." For the first time since Miles Sutton had arrived, he turned to look at Margaret Flynn. She was staring at him, her green eyes wide. Not with relief, not yet. More like she couldn't quite believe what was happening, like she was afraid to hope. And there was something else in her expression, something I couldn't quite read at the time, but that would make sense later, when I learned the full story. Recognition. It was brief, just a flicker. Her eyes widened slightly when he'd said his name. Her lips parted like she might speak, then closed again. So quick I almost missed it, but I was watching closely, the way a lawman learns to watch, and I saw. "Ma'am," Miles said, his voice gentler now. He took off his hat, revealing hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. "If you'll come with me." Margaret Flynn didn't move. Her arms tightened around her baby. "How do I know?" she started, then stopped. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't spoken in days. Maybe she hadn't. Who would she have spoken to in the days leading up to this auction? "How do I know your intentions are any better than theirs?" A fair question. A brave question, under the circumstances. Miles held her gaze. "You don't," he said simply. "But I give you my word, ma'am. No harm will come to you or your boy. Not from me. Not from anyone, if I can prevent it." "Your word." She said it flat, testing the weight of it. "It's all I've got to offer right now. That and a roof over your head, food in your belly, and safety for as long as you need it." The baby squirmed in her arms, started to fuss again. Margaret looked down at her son, then back at Miles. Then for just a moment her eyes swept across the crowd, across the faces of the men who'd been bidding on her like she was livestock, across Big Jack with his scarred face and hungry eyes, across Turner with his smug satisfaction. What choice did she have, really? "All right," she whispered. Miles nodded once. Then he turned to Turner. "We done here?" Turner's jaw worked like he wanted to argue. But the money was counted, the debt was paid, and even in Redemption Creek, there were limits to how far a man could push things. "Going once," Turner said, the words sounding strangled. "Going twice." He paused, like he was hoping someone would object. No one did. "Sold to Mr. Miles Sutton." The gavel came down. The sound echoed off the false fronts of the buildings, and just like that, it was done. Miles offered his hand to help Margaret Flynn down from the platform. She hesitated, then took it. Her hand was small in his, and I saw him adjust his grip, careful not to hold too tight. Big Jack stepped into their path as they reached the ground. "Now hold on," he growled. "That ain't right. I had the bid. I was going to go higher." Miles finally looked at him, really looked at him, and something in that blue gaze made Big Jack take half a step back, despite himself. "But you didn't," Miles said, quiet, calm, absolutely certain. "Auction's over." "You don't know who you're—" "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Miles's hand didn't move toward his gun. Didn't need to. "Now step aside." For a long moment, they stood there. Big Jack was bigger, meaner, had a reputation for violence that stretched from Redemption Creek to the mining camps in the hills. But there was something in Miles Sutton's stillness that spoke of a different kind of danger, the kind that didn't need to brag or bluster. Big Jack stepped aside. Miles guided Margaret Flynn through the crowd. Men moved out of their way, though whether out of respect or something else, I couldn't say. I followed at a distance. Couldn't help myself. My sheriff's instincts were screaming that this wasn't over, that something was off about the whole situation, and I needed to understand what I'd just witnessed. Miles led her to his horse. The buckskin was still breathing hard, sides heaving. "I've got a room at the boarding house," Miles said. "Just for tonight. We'll leave at first light, get you and the boy somewhere safe." "Where?" Margaret asked. The baby was quiet now, watching Miles with wide eyes. "My ranch, up near Whitefish Creek. It's not much, but it's peaceful. You'll have your own room, privacy, time to figure out what comes next." She studied his face like she was looking for the lie in his words. "And what do you expect from me, Mr. Sutton, in exchange for this rescue?" "Nothing," he said. "I owed your husband a debt. Consider it paid." That's when I saw her reaction again, that flicker of something. She knew. Somehow, she knew who Miles was even before he'd introduced himself, knew about the debt, but she didn't say anything, just nodded and let him help her onto the horse. Miles swung up behind her, careful not to jostle the baby. He gathered the reins and looked down at me for the first time. Our eyes met. He gave me a small nod, the kind one man gives another when acknowledging a witness. Then he turned the horse and started down the street toward the boarding house. I stood there in the dust as the crowd began to disperse. Men drifting back to their saloons and their claims, already turning the auction into a story they'd tell over drinks. The widow and the stranger, the mysterious rescuer who'd appeared out of nowhere. But I'd been a lawman too long to accept simple stories. I'd seen the money change hands. Legal transaction on the face of it. Turner couldn't contest it, wouldn't dare with witnesses present. But I'd also seen Margaret Flynn's face when Miles said his name. Seen that flash of recognition she'd tried to hide. And I'd seen something else. Something in the way Miles Sutton had looked at her. Not with the hunger I'd seen in the other men's eyes. Not even with pity, exactly. More like recognition, understanding. The way one wounded creature might look at another. I collected my horse and rode back toward Whitefish Creek as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The depositions could wait. I had too many questions burning in my mind. Who was Patrick Flynn to Miles Sutton? What debt could a dead man's widow possibly represent? And why had Margaret Flynn recognized a man she supposedly never met? The answers would come in time. Some from Miles himself over whiskey in my office on winter nights when the loneliness got too heavy for him to carry alone. Some from Margaret years later, when we'd become friends and she felt safe enough to speak of those dark days. And some I'd witnessed myself, watching their story unfold over the months that followed. But that evening, riding home through the long shadows, all I knew was this. I'd seen something rare in Redemption Creek. Something I hadn't expected to find in a town that had forgotten what decency looked like. I'd seen a man do the right thing when it cost him everything he had. And I'd seen a woman maintain her dignity when the world was determined to strip it away. The young journalist across from me set down his pencil. So it was true, he said. He really did buy her at auction. I took a sip of my whiskey, let it burn its way down. He paid off a debt, I corrected. That's different than buying. Though I suppose to the law, to men like Turner, the distinction didn't matter much. And they fell in love? The young man's eyes were bright with the romance of it. Eventually, I said, but it wasn't simple. Love never is, especially when it's born from desperation and duty. I set my glass down. You want the legend, or you want the truth? The truth, he said immediately. I smiled. Then you'd better pour yourself another drink. This is going to take a while. And outside my window, the evening star appeared in the darkening sky. The same star that had been rising that night in 1878 when Miles Sutton rode into Redemption Creek and changed 3 lives forever. His own, Margaret Flynn's, and in a way, mine too. Because I learned something that day that would shape the rest of my time wearing a badge. I learned that sometimes the law and justice walk different trails, and a man has to choose which one he's going to follow. Miles Sutton made his choice that day on the auction block. I'd make mine in the months to come when Turner returned seeking revenge, and I had to decide which mattered more, the letter of the law or the spirit of it. But that's a story for another part of this tale. For now, just know this. What started that hot July day in Redemption Creek wasn't a rescue. It was the first step on a long road toward redemption. For all of us. They left Redemption Creek before dawn. I know this because I was watching from my window at the boarding house. Couldn't sleep after what I'd witnessed. Kept seeing Margaret Flynn's face on that auction block, kept hearing the casual cruelty in Turner's voice as he'd described her like livestock. Miles Sutton was already loading a wagon when the first gray light touched the eastern peaks. Not the buckskin he'd ridden in on, that horse was spent, 3 days of hard riding having taken its toll. He'd bought a sturdy mare and a serviceable wagon from the livery, paying cash money without haggling. The wagon, I learned later, was a kindness. He could have put Margaret on horseback, made better time that way. But he'd seen the baby, seen how exhausted she was, and understood that 2 days on a hard saddle would break what little spirit she had left. Small kindnesses. That's what I remember most about Miles Sutton, the little considerations that revealed the man beneath the silence. Margaret emerged from the boarding house as the sun cleared the mountains. She carried William wrapped in a thin blanket, and I noticed she'd changed into her other dress. Still calico, still worn, but cleaner. Her hair was pulled back tight under her bonnet. She looked like a woman preparing for battle. Spine straight, jaw set, eyes forward. Miles helped her onto the wagon seat without a word. She settled William against her chest, and I saw her wince slightly. The baby was getting heavy for arms that had held him through too many sleepless nights. Miles noticed too. He reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a folded quilt. "For the boy," he said. "Can lay him down when he sleeps. Save your arms." Margaret looked at the quilt, then at Miles. Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Those were the first words she'd spoken to him since the auction. Miles climbed onto the wagon seat beside her, not too close, respectful of the space between them. He gathered the reins and clicked to the mare. The wagon rolled forward through the empty streets of Redemption Creek, past the saloons where men were already drinking their breakfast, past the assay office and the abandoned mine works, past Turner's Bank, its windows dark and accusing. I watched until they disappeared into the morning haze. Then I went to find the town marshal, useless as he was, and file a report. Legal transaction or not, something about the whole situation stank worse than the privies behind the mining camps. I wanted it documented, wanted a record, in case Turner decided the debt wasn't really paid after all. The marshal took my statement with the enthusiasm of a man being asked to dig his own grave. Wrote it down sloppy, filed it wrong, probably lost it within a week. But I'd done what I could within the bounds of the law. What happened next, I had to piece together from what Miles told me later, from what Margaret shared, from the evidence I saw with my own eyes when I visited the ranch 2 weeks afterward. This is how it went. The first hour of travel passed in silence. Miles kept the mare at a steady walk, following the trail north out of Redemption Creek toward the foothills. The land here was harsh country, sagebrush and scrub pine, rocky outcroppings that threw back the morning heat, creek beds that ran dry 3 months out of the year. William fussed in Margaret's arms, sensing her tension through whatever mysterious connection babies have with their mothers. She bounced him gently, humming something tuneless to soothe him. Miles noticed her looking back over her shoulder for the third time in as many minutes. "Expecting someone?" he asked. Margaret's hands tightened on the baby. "I don't know. Are you? Meaning?" "Meaning I don't know you, Mr. Sutton." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the steel underneath. "I don't know why you paid that money. I don't know what you think you're owed. And I don't know if someone's following us because you've made enemies I should know about." Fair questions, all of them. Miles was quiet for a moment, considering. The mare plodded on, hooves raising small puffs of dust. "I knew your husband," he said finally, "during the war. He saved my life at Chickamauga, took a bullet meant for me." Margaret went very still. Her hand moved to the locket at her throat, a small gesture, unconscious. Inside that locket, Miles would later learn, was a curl of Patrick Flynn's red hair and a photograph taken on their wedding day. "Patrick never mentioned you," she said. A lie. Miles could hear it in her voice, but he let it pass. "We lost touch after the war," he said. "I heard he'd settled out this way. Heard through a man in Billings that there was an auction, that Patrick Flynn's widow and child were being sold to pay his debts. And you rode 3 days to pay those debts." She said it flat, like she was still trying to understand the why of it. "I owed him my life. Seemed only fair to give his family a chance to keep theirs." Margaret looked down at William. The baby had finally settled, his small fist curled against her collarbone. "Patrick drank," she said quietly. "Gambled. Lost everything we had and then some. Whatever man you knew in the war, Mr. Sutton, He wasn't the man I buried 3 months ago. Miles heard the pain in her voice, the anger underneath it, the grief. War changes people, he said. Not always for the better. Is that what happened to you? The question surprised him. He glanced at her and found her watching him with those green eyes, assessing. I don't know what you mean. You live alone on a ranch. You ride 3 days on word of an auction. You pay cash money for strangers. She paused. That's not normal behavior, Mr. Sutton. That's the behavior of a man running from something, or towards something. I'm trying to figure out which. Smart woman. Miles had known that from the moment he'd seen her on that auction block, maintaining her dignity while men bid on her like property. But hearing her speak, hearing the sharp intelligence beneath the fear, he understood she was more than smart. She was a survivor, and survivors asked hard questions. Maybe both, he said. Before Margaret could respond, Miles's hand went up in a gesture that said, wait. He'd heard something, or maybe sensed it, the way a man learns to sense danger after years of having his life depend on it. Hoofbeats. Behind them, moving faster than travelers should be moving in this heat. Get down, Miles said. In the wagon bed. Cover yourself and the boy with the quilt. Margaret's face went pale. What? Now? The authority in his voice brooked no argument. Margaret scrambled over the seat into the wagon bed, clutching William close. Miles tossed her the quilt, and she pulled it over them both, disappearing beneath the faded fabric. Miles kept the mare moving at the same steady pace. Didn't speed up, didn't slow down. Just a man driving a wagon on a summer morning. The hoofbeats grew louder. 3 riders came around the bend behind them, pushing their horses hard. Even from a distance, Miles recognized the big one in front, Big Jack Malone. And he'd brought friends. They caught up to the wagon within minutes, spread out as they approached, flanking Miles on both sides. Professional, or at least experienced. These men had done this before. Miles kept his hands loose on the reins, didn't reach for the rifle tucked under the seat. Not yet. Big Jack pulled alongside, his scarred face split in a grin that showed missing teeth. Well now, he said, if it ain't the hero from yesterday. Out for a morning drive? Miles didn't answer, kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Asked you a question. Big Jack's hand dropped to the gun at his hip, not drawing, just reminding Miles it was there. Free country, Miles said. Man can drive where he likes. That's true. That's very true. Big Jack leaned forward in his saddle. But see, we got a problem. Mr. Turner, he's been thinking about that auction, thinking maybe it wasn't exactly legal. Selling a woman and her child like that. Miles almost laughed. Turner claiming concern for legality after what he'd orchestrated. Money's paid. Debts settled. Well, that's the thing. One of the other riders, a lean man with a knife scar on his cheek, spoke up. Mr. Turner says the debt was $150, not $120. Says there was interest he forgot to mention. Convenient, Miles said. Ain't it, though? Big Jack's grin widened. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn that wagon around. We're going to escort you back to Redemption Creek, and we're going to sort this all out proper-like with Mr. Turner. Under the quilt in the wagon bed, Margaret held her breath. William squirmed against her, and she pressed her hand gently over his mouth, praying he wouldn't cry out. Miles considered his options. 3 armed men, open country. No cover except some rocks about 50 yards ahead where the trail bent toward a dry creek bed. 50 yards. He'd have to time it perfect. And if I refuse? Miles asked. Keeping his voice casual, Big Jack's grin disappeared. Then we take the woman and the kid back anyway. And you wake up tomorrow morning, if you wake up at all, with a headache and empty pockets. The third rider, younger than the others, hadn't spoken yet. Miles could see his hand shaking slightly on his reins. Nervous. That made him dangerous. Nervous men pulled triggers when they shouldn't. That's a lot of effort, Miles said, for $30. Oh, this ain't about the money. Big Jack leaned closer. This is about you riding into town like you own the place, showing me up in front of everybody. Nobody does that to Big Jack Malone. Nobody. There it was. The real reason. Wounded pride. The rocks were 30 yards ahead now. I see, Miles said. So this is personal. Damn right it's personal. 20 yards. Miles's hand shifted slightly on the reins. Under the seat, his boot nudged closer to where the rifle rested. 10 yards. Well then, Miles said quietly, I apologize. Big Jack blinked, confused. You what? I apologize for embarrassing you. And Miles slapped the reins hard across the mare's back. The mare wasn't a racing horse, but she was Montana-bred and understood urgency. She leaped forward, the wagon lurching behind her. Big Jack cursed and grabbed for his gun. Miles threw himself sideways, snatching the rifle from under the seat as he rolled. The wagon careened toward the rocks, and he hit the ground hard, shoulder taking the impact. A gunshot cracked the air. The bullet went wide, hitting rock and spraying fragments. The mare kept running, the wagon bouncing wildly. Margaret's scream was cut off as another shot rang out. Miles prayed the quilt would protect them if a bullet found the wagon bed. He came up on one knee behind a boulder, rifle already shouldered. Fired once, deliberately high. Warning shot. The three riders had wheeled their horses. Confused by the sudden chaos, the nervous one fired twice, both shots wild. Big Jack was shouting, trying to organize them. Miles fired again, this time close enough to make Big Jack's horse rear. The big man fought to control his mount, cursing steadily. Next one's not a warning, Miles called out. His voice was steady, no fear in it. Just cold certainty. The mare had stopped 50 yards up the trail, the wagon tilted at an angle. Miles couldn't see if Margaret and William were all right. Had to trust they'd stayed down, stayed quiet. Big Jack got his horse under control. He stared at Miles across the distance, rage twisting his scarred face. You're a dead man, Sutton, he said. You know that? Mr. Turner's got reach. He'll find you wherever you hole up. And when he does, tell Turner if he wants to talk, he can ride to Whitefish Creek and file a legal complaint with Sheriff Tom Dawson. Otherwise, this is over. Miles worked the lever action on the rifle. The metallic sound carried clear in the morning air. Your choice, Jack. Talk or bleed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the horses breathing hard and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then the nervous rider spoke. Jack, maybe we should— Shut up. Big Jack's eyes never left Miles. This ain't over, Sutton, not by a long shot. But he was already turning his horse. The other two followed, casting nervous glances back at Miles as they retreated. Miles stayed in position, rifle ready, until they disappeared around the bend. Even then he waited, counting to 100, making sure it wasn't a feint. Only when he was certain they were gone did he lower the rifle and run to the wagon. Margaret was hunched in the wagon bed, the quilt pulled tight around her and William. Her whole body was shaking. Ma'am, Miles said gently, they're gone. You're safe. She looked up at him, and he saw tears on her face, but also anger, fire beneath the fear. Safe? Her voice shook. They shot at us. They were going to take us back to Turner, to that man. She couldn't finish. William was crying now, loud wails of distress. Margaret tried to soothe him, but her own hands were trembling too badly. Miles set the rifle in the wagon bed and reached for the baby without thinking. May I? Margaret hesitated, then passed William to him. Miles took the boy carefully, supporting his head the way he'd once seen a camp follower do during the war. He'd never held a baby before, not really, but instinct guided him. He walked a slow circle, bouncing gently, making low shushing sounds. William's cries gradually subsided to hiccups, then silence. The baby stared up at Miles with wide eyes, as if trying to understand what manner of creature this was. When Miles turned back to the wagon, Margaret was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. You're bleeding, she said. Miles looked down. His shirt was torn at the shoulder where he'd hit the ground, and blood had seeped through. The wound from rolling on rocky ground, probably. He hadn't even felt it in the moment. It's nothing. Let me see. Ma'am, I'm fine. Mr. Sutton, her voice was firm, you just saved our lives. The least I can do is tend to your wound. Now let me see. There was no arguing with that tone. Miles handed William back to her and shrugged out of his shirt with some difficulty. The wound pulled when he moved. Margaret had him sit on the wagon tailgate while she examined his shoulder. Her touch was gentle but efficient. She'd done this before, he realized. Tended injuries. "It's not deep," she said, but it needs cleaning. "Do you have whiskey?" "In my saddlebag, on the buckskin." She found it, along with a relatively clean cloth. Miles hissed when she poured the whiskey directly on the wound, but didn't pull away. "Patrick came back from the war with scars," Margaret said quietly as she worked. "I learned to clean wounds, to stitch them when needed. He never talked about how he got them, but sometimes at night he'd wake up screaming." Her hands paused. "Is that why you live alone, Mr. Sutton? The nightmares?" Miles didn't answer. Wasn't sure he could. Margaret resumed her work, tearing strips from the cloth to bind the wound. Her fingers brushed his skin, and he was acutely aware of how long it had been since anyone had touched him with gentleness. "There," she said finally. "It should heal clean if you keep it dry." "Thank you." She stepped back, putting proper distance between them again. But something had shifted. They'd been through danger together, survived it together. That created a bond whether they wanted it or not. "They'll come back," Margaret said. "Won't they?" Miles pulled his torn shirt back on carefully. "Maybe, but not today. And by tonight we'll be on my land. That's different territory, different rules." "Will that stop them?" He looked at her directly. "I don't know, but I promise you this, I won't let them take you, either of you." Margaret studied his face. "Why? Why would you risk your life for people you don't even know?" Miles had asked himself the same question in the hours since he'd ridden into Redemption Creek. He'd told her about owing Patrick, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to put into words. "Because," he said slowly, "I spent 4 years in a war where I watched good people suffer for no reason, watched them die for causes they didn't understand. And when it was over, I told myself if I ever had the chance to stop that kind of suffering, I would, no matter what it cost." He climbed back onto the wagon seat. "Yesterday I had that chance. Today I'm following through. That's all." It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. Margaret climbed up beside him, settling William in her lap. The baby had fallen asleep, exhausted by fear and tears. "Patrick said you were the best man he ever knew," she said softly. "I thought he was exaggerating. He had a habit of seeing the best in people, even when it wasn't there." Miles gathered the reins. "Your husband saved my life. He was brave when it mattered most. Whatever happened to him after the war, that doesn't erase what he did." Margaret's hand went to her locket again. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." They rode in silence for a while, putting distance between themselves and Redemption Creek, between themselves and Turner's Reach. But Miles knew this wasn't over. Men like Turner didn't give up when challenged. They nursed grudges. They planned revenge. The question was when, not if. They reached the ranch 2 hours before sunset. Margaret saw it first as they crested the last rise. A valley opening up before them, green with summer grass. A creek winding through it, catching the golden light. Pine trees climbing the slopes on either side. And nestled at the base of the valley, a cabin with a stone chimney. It was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected. Not grand, not impressive by city standards, but honest, real. A place carved from wilderness by hard work and determination. "Home," Miles said simply. He drove the wagon down into the valley. As they approached, Margaret could see the details. A barn that looked solid, well-maintained. A corral with horses watching their approach with pricked ears. A vegetable garden to one side of the cabin, neat rows showing care. This was a working ranch, not just a man hiding from the world. Miles pulled the wagon up to the cabin and set the brake. He climbed down, then offered his hand to help Margaret. She took it, careful not to wake William. Her legs were unsteady after the long ride, after the fear and the adrenaline and the slow burn of exhaustion that came after. "I'll show you inside," Miles said. "Get you settled. Then I need to tend the horses." The cabin was simple. One main room with a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, shelves holding books and supplies. A ladder led to a loft above, and to the left a door stood open to a smaller room. Miles led her there. "This is for you and the boy. It's not much, but the bed's sound and the window looks out on the creek." Margaret stepped into the room. It held a bed covered with a handmade quilt, a small chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin. The window did indeed look out on the creek, and she could hear the water burbling over stones. After months of worry, after weeks of dread, after the horror of the auction and the terror of the chase, this small room felt like sanctuary. "It's perfect," she whispered. Miles cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "I'll be in the loft. Give you privacy. There's water in the barrel outside the door if you need to wash. Food in the larder. Make yourself at home." "Mr. Sutton," Margaret said. He turned back. "Thank you for all of it." He nodded once, then left her alone. Margaret laid William on the bed, surrounding him with pillows so he wouldn't roll off. The baby slept on, worn out by the day's events. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself cry. Quiet tears, relief and fear and gratitude, all mixed together. She'd been holding herself together for so long, holding herself upright through Patrick's descent into darkness, through his death, death, through the humiliation of losing everything. But here, in this small room with its simple bed and the sound of water outside, she could finally let go, just for a moment. Then she washed her face, checked on William, and went to see what she could do to help with supper. She wouldn't be a burden, wouldn't be just another mouth to feed. She'd find a way to be useful, to earn her place until she could figure out what came next. That night, after a simple meal of beans and bacon and bread that Miles had cooked with surprising competence, Margaret put William to bed in the small room. She sang to him one of the lullabies her mother had sung to her back in Boston, when the world was simpler and futures seemed certain. William's eyes drifted closed. His breathing deepened into the trusting sleep of infancy. Margaret kissed his forehead and stood, her back aching from the wagon ride and the constant tension. In the main room, Miles was sitting by the fire, a book open in his lap, but his eyes distant. He looked up when she emerged. "He settled all right?" "Like an angel?" Margaret hesitated, then took the chair across from him. "I wanted to ask you something." "All right." "What you said about Patrick saving your life. Can you tell me about it? About what happened?" Miles was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows on the log walls. "It was Chickamauga," he said finally. "September 1863. Hell of a battle. 2 days of fighting in the woods, men so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead." His hands tightened on the book. "Second day, my unit got separated. Confederate cavalry caught us in a clearing. I took a saber cut across my arm, got thrown from my horse, 3 of them coming at me, and I had an empty rifle and 1 shot in my pistol." Margaret could see it in his eyes now. He wasn't here anymore. He was back there, in that clearing, facing death. Patrick wasn't cavalry. He was infantry, had no business being in that fight, but he came out of the trees running, rifle blazing, screaming like a demon, shot 1 of them dead, bayoneted another. The 3rd one shot him. Miles touched his left shoulder. Bullet went right here, through and through. Should have hit his lung but missed by inches. He fell, and I dragged him back to our lines while our boys laid down, covering fire. "You saved him too, then," Margaret said softly. "Maybe. But he saved me first. And later, in the hospital tent, when they thought I was dead and sent word to my family, Patrick wrote them. Told them I was alive, gave them hope when they had none." He finally looked at her. "So when I heard his widow and child were being sold like property to pay his debts, I didn't think about it. I just rode." Margaret felt tears on her face again. "He never told me the details, just said he'd served with good men, that the war took things from him but gave him brothers." "We were brothers," Miles agreed, "forged in fire." They sat in silence, both lost in thoughts of a man who'd connected their lives across death itself. Finally Margaret rose. "I should sleep. William will be up before dawn." "Ma'am," Miles said, "you can stay as long as you need. There's no rush to figure out what comes next. Thank you, Mr. Sutton, for everything." She went to her room and closed the door gently. Miles sat by the fire for another hour, not reading, just thinking. About Patrick, about the war, about the weight of debts owed to the dead and promises made to the living. Sometime deep in the night, Margaret woke to screaming. She bolted upright in the darkness, heart pounding. William stirred but didn't wake. The screaming came again, raw, anguished, words she couldn't make out. Miles. She grabbed her shawl and hurried into the main room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. The screaming was coming from the loft. Margaret climbed the ladder quickly. Miles was thrashing in his bedroll, still asleep but caught in some nightmare's grip. "No," he was shouting. Get down, they're coming through." Then words in what might have been the desperate commands of battle. "Fall back! Patrick, fall back!" Margaret knelt beside him. "Mr. Sutton, Miles, wake up. You're dreaming." He didn't hear her. His hands clawed at the air, fighting invisible enemies. She took his shoulders, shook him gently. "Miles, you're safe. You're home. Wake up." His eyes snapped open. For a moment he didn't see her, saw something else, something that made his face go gray with terror. His hand shot out, catching her wrist in a grip that would leave bruises. "Miles," she said firmly, "look at me. You're safe. It's Margaret. You're at your ranch in Montana. The war is over." Slowly, recognition filtered back into his eyes. He released her wrist like it had burned him. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "God, I'm sorry. Did I hurt you?" "I'm fine. You were having a nightmare." He sat up, running his hands through his hair. His whole body was shaking. Sweat soaked his undershirt despite the cool night air. "Chickamauga," he said hoarsely. "It's always Chickamauga. I'm back there, and Patrick's bleeding out, and I can't stop it. Or sometimes it's worse. Sometimes I can't reach him in time, and he dies, and it's my fault, all my fault. It wasn't your fault." Margaret moved closer, not touching, but present. "You saved each other, that's what you said. But I lived, and he didn't. He died in some fever bed 3,000 miles from that battlefield, and I wasn't there, couldn't help him, couldn't save him again." The guilt in his voice was so raw it hurt to hear. "Patrick made his choices," Margaret said. "The drinking, the gambling, those were his demons, not yours. You couldn't have saved him from those even if you'd been there." Miles looked at her, and in the dim light she saw the same haunted look she'd seen in Patrick's eyes. The look of a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, and didn't know how to lay down the burden of it. "Does it get better?" he asked. "The nightmares?" "I don't know. Patrick never told me. She should go back downstairs, should leave him to his privacy. But something held her there. My mother used to say," she offered, "that nightmares lose their power when you speak them in the light. That secrets kept in darkness grow stronger." "Your mother sounds wise." She was. "She died when I was 16. Margaret surprised herself by adding, "Sometimes I dream about her, about the life I had before I met Patrick, before I came west. And I wonder if she'd be disappointed in the choices I made." "Are you disappointed?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "I loved Patrick, the man I married anyway, before the war changed him, before Montana broke him. So, no, I'm not sorry I chose him, but I'm sorry for what that choice cost me, cost us." She met Miles's eyes. "I'm sorry William will never know his father, but I'm not sorry we survived, and I'm not sorry you came to that auction." "Neither am I," Miles said quietly. They stayed there in the darkness, two survivors of different wars, finding unexpected comfort in shared honesty. Finally, Margaret rose. "Try to sleep. The nightmares have less power when you remember you're not alone." She climbed back down the ladder to her room, checked on William, still sleeping peacefully, then lay in bed, listening to the creak outside her window, thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago she'd been facing the auction with nothing but terror and the faint, desperate hope that Patrick's dying words about finding Miles Sutton might somehow save them. Now here she was, under that same man's roof, tending his wounds and waking him from nightmares. She'd recognized his name the moment he'd spoken it at the auction, had seen the shock of it like lightning through her body. Patrick's friend, the man he'd told her to find, appearing like an answer to prayer. But she hadn't told Miles that. Hadn't admitted that Patrick, in his final fever-racked hours, had made her promise to find Miles Sutton if something happened. Had said, "He's in Montana, best man I ever knew. He'll help you." Why hadn't she told him? Fear, maybe. Fear that if Miles knew Patrick had sent her to him, he'd feel even more obligated. That this rescue would become nothing but duty, and what little choice she had left would vanish. Or maybe fear that the Miles Sutton Patrick had described wouldn't match the reality, that no man could be that good, that honorable. But so far, he was, and that scared her more than anything. Because if Miles Sutton was truly as good as Patrick had promised, what did that mean for her? For the feelings she could feel starting to grow, despite her best efforts to keep them buried? She was a widow of 3 months, a woman sold at auction, a mother with nothing to offer but gratitude and the slim hope that someday she might stand on her own again. She had no business feeling anything for Miles Sutton except thankfulness. But as she drifted toward sleep, Margaret couldn't help remembering the gentleness in his hands when he'd held William, the certainty in his voice when he'd promised to protect them, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd asked if the nightmares ever got better. She was in dangerous territory. She knew that. The question was whether she had the strength to navigate it without losing herself again. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The sound carried across the valley, lonesome and wild. Margaret closed her eyes and tried not to think about the future, tried not to think about Turner's threat, still hanging over them like a storm cloud, tried not to think about the fact that Miles Sutton had risked his life for them once and would probably have to do it again. Tomorrow would come soon enough. For tonight, they were safe. And sometimes that had to be enough. 3 weeks passed. I know because I kept count, waiting for the other boot to drop, waiting for Turner to make his move, or for Big Jack to come skulking around Whitefish Creek looking for revenge. But the days slipped by quiet and peaceful, and I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the matter was settled. I should have known better. Nothing's ever settled when pride and money are involved, but for those 3 weeks, I let myself believe that Miles and Margaret had found a pocket of safety in a dangerous world. I was wrong, of course, but I'll get to that. First, let me tell you about those weeks, because they mattered. Because they showed me who these people really were when the immediate danger had passed and they had to figure out how to live with each other. Miles told me some of it later, over whiskey in my office, when winter had locked down the territory and he needed to talk to someone besides the woman he was falling in love with. Margaret filled in the rest, years afterward, when we'd become friends and she felt safe enough to be honest about those early days. Margaret took to ranch life like she'd been born to it, which surprised both of them. She'd been a school teacher's daughter from Boston, after all, city-bred, educated, used to a certain refinement that Montana territory didn't offer. But she was also a survivor, and survivors adapt. She took over the cooking first, which was a mercy for Miles. The man could manage beans and bacon well enough, but Margaret could make a proper stew, could bake bread that didn't sit in your stomach like a stone, could stretch supplies in ways that came from managing Patrick's gambling debts for 2 years. She mended Miles's clothes without being asked, planted herbs in the kitchen garden, started teaching William his letters, even though the boy was barely old enough to sit up on his own. She was building a life, I realized later, staking a claim to normalcy in a world that had tried to strip it from her. And Miles was learning what it meant to have people who needed him for more than just his gun or his strong back. He'd wake before dawn and do his chores quiet, trying not to disturb Margaret and the baby. But she'd hear him anyway and have coffee ready when he came back in. Small kindnesses, exchanged without comment, building into something neither of them had words for yet. William took to Miles like he'd known him his whole short life. The baby would reach for him when he came through the door, would quiet when Miles held him, would fall asleep against his shoulder while Margaret cleared the supper dishes. I saw it myself when I rode out to check on them 2 weeks after the auction. Miles was sitting on the porch, William cradled in one arm while he whittled something with his free hand. The baby was watching the knife move with serious concentration, and Miles was talking to him low and steady about horses, about the weather, about nothing and everything. Margaret stood in the doorway watching them, and the look on her face, well, it wasn't gratitude. It was something deeper, more dangerous for a woman who'd been widowed barely 3 months. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be simple. Nothing about love ever is. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with good intentions and bad timing. Late August, Whitefish Creek held its annual Founders' Day celebration. Nothing fancy by city standards, but for us, it was the social event of the season. Music, dancing, food, enough to feed half the territory. A chance for folks to gather and remember we were more than just isolated homesteads fighting the land. I'd mentioned it to Miles during my visit, told him he should bring Margaret and the boy. Let people meet them proper, start the process of making them part of the community instead of just the subject of gossip. Because there was gossip, plenty of it. Word had spread about the auction, about Miles paying cash money for a widow and her baby. Some folks thought it noble. Others thought it scandalous. Most just thought it strange, and strange made for good talking over fences and in general stores. Miles was reluctant. "She's been through enough without folks staring at her," he said. But Margaret, when he mentioned it that evening, surprised him. "I'd like to go," she said quietly. "I'd like to meet your neighbors, your friends." "I don't have many friends." "Sheriff Dawson seems to think well of you. And someone has to run the general store, the church, all the rest. I can't hide out here forever." She was right, though Miles didn't much like it. So when the day came, he hitched up the wagon, helped Margaret and William aboard, and drove them to town. I was there waiting, watching the road when they arrived. Margaret wore the blue dress Miles had bought her at Mrs. Caldwell's store. It brought out the green of her eyes, made her look younger than the hardship of recent months would suggest. She'd done her hair up proper, and she held William on her hip with the casual confidence of a woman who'd learned to manage a baby with one hand and life's complications with the other. Miles helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Neither of them seemed to notice, but I did. And I wasn't the only one. The celebration was in full swing. Tables groaning with food, a fiddler and a man with a squeeze box making music that got feet tapping despite the heat. Children running between the adults, playing games that had no rules except not to get caught. Mrs. Caldwell descended on them immediately. "Miles Sutton," she exclaimed. "And this must be Mrs. Flynn. My dear, welcome to Whitefish Creek. And who is this handsome young man?" She reached for William, who went to her without protest. The boy had his mother's ease with people, it seemed. "This is William," Margaret said. "And thank you for the welcome, Mrs. Caldwell. Your town is lovely." "Oh, call me Ida, please. Mrs. Caldwell makes me feel like my mother-in-law's ghost." She bounced William expertly. "Come, dear, let me introduce you around. Miles, you go get yourself some punch and try to be sociable for once." And just like that, Margaret was swept into the crowd of women, leaving Miles standing there looking slightly lost. I clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, let's get that punch before Ida works her way back to us." We did, and for a while things went smoothly. I introduced Miles and Margaret to the respectable folks, the minister, the doctor, the couple who ran the mercantile. Everyone was polite, if a bit curious. Margaret handled their questions with grace, giving enough information to satisfy without revealing too much. "My husband passed 3 months ago," she'd say. "Mr. Sutton knew him from the war. He was kind enough to offer me and William a safe place until I could get back on my feet." Simple. Dignified. True enough that it wasn't a lie. Vague enough that it didn't invite speculation. But then the music started up for dancing and things got complicated. Miles asked Margaret to dance. I could see the moment he decided to do it, could see the way he squared his shoulders like a man about to walk into gunfire. The man would face down 3 armed riders without flinching, but asking a woman to dance near about paralyzed him. Margaret said yes with a smile that lit up her whole face. They joined the other couples for a Virginia reel. Miles moved with surprising grace for a man more comfortable on horseback than a dance floor. And Margaret, she was light on her feet, laughing as they spun through the figures, looking younger and happier than I'd yet seen her. I watched them and thought, this is what healing looks like. This is what happens when 2 broken people find each other and start to mend. I should have been paying attention to the other watchers instead. Alderman Briggs stood on the edge of the dance floor, arms crossed, face set in lines of disapproval. He was a sour man on his best days, the kind who found fault with sunshine and complained about rain. He'd been trying to run Whitefish Creek like it was Philadelphia instead of Montana Territory, and most of us ignored him. But he had a following among the more conservative element, the folks who thought civilization meant rules and rules meant knowing your place. When the dance ended, he stepped forward. "A word, Mr. Sutton," he said. Loud enough to carry, the music faltered. Folks turned to look. Miles's hand was still at Margaret's waist. "Can it wait? We're in the middle of—" "No, it cannot wait." Briggs' voice was cold. "I've kept silent on this matter out of Christian charity, but I cannot in good conscience continue." Margaret's face went pale. She knew what was coming. So did I. "This arrangement of yours," Briggs continued, "with Mrs. Flynn, it's unseemly, sir. Improper. You bought this woman at an auction like she was livestock. Now you've installed her in your home, unchaperoned. The talk is all over the territory." The crowd had gone dead quiet. Miles's voice was steady, but I could hear the edge underneath. "Mrs. Flynn is my guest. She and her son have their own room. Everything is proper and respectable." "Proper?" Briggs snorted. "A widowed woman barely out of mourning, living alone with a bachelor. That's not proper, Mr. Sutton. That's scandal waiting to happen." Margaret's hand tightened on Miles's arm. "Mr. Briggs, I assure you, I'm not interested in your assurances, madam." Briggs didn't even look at her. "I'm interested in maintaining standards in this community, and I'm hereby giving notice that the town council will be reviewing this situation. We cannot have men purchasing women like property, regardless of the justification. It sets a dangerous precedent." Something in Miles went very still, that kind of stillness that comes before violence. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's quite enough, Alderman." A woman stepped forward from the crowd. Blonde hair, pretty face, expensive dress that didn't quite suit a frontier celebration. I recognized her, even though I'd only seen her once or twice before. Rebecca Wilson, the sawmill owner's daughter, the woman who'd courted Miles 2 years back. She walked right up to Briggs, her chin high. "Mr. Sutton's personal affairs are none of the council's business," she said firmly. "And I'll thank you not to speak to Mrs. Flynn as if she were at fault for being the victim of unfortunate circumstances." Briggs sputtered. "Miss Wilson, this is hardly your place to judge," Rebecca finished. "Mrs. Flynn, I don't believe we've met properly. I'm Rebecca Wilson. I knew Mr. Sutton some time ago, and I can attest to his character. If he says the situation is proper, then it is." She turned to Margaret and Miles, and I saw something complicated in her eyes. Regret, maybe, or recognition of roads not taken. "I was wrong about you, Miles," she said quietly, so only they could hear. "I wanted you to be someone you weren't, but Mrs. Flynn—" She met Margaret's eyes. "She sees who you actually are. That's the difference." Then louder for the crowd. Now I believe the music was about to start again. "Shall we all stop gossiping and get back to celebrating?" The fiddler, bless him, took the hint and launched into a lively tune. The crowd's attention fractured, people drifting back to their conversations and their dancing, though I could see the glances, hear the whispers. Briggs stood there a moment longer, his moment of self-righteousness spoiled. Then he stalked off, his small contingent of supporters trailing after him. Miles turned to Rebecca. "Thank you. You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." She smiled, but it was sad around the edges. I spent 2 years trying to make you into someone who'd fit in my world. But you were right to say no. You belong out there, in the hills, with the sky and the silence, and with people who understand that." She looked at Margaret. "He's a good man, Mrs. Flynn. Stubborn, silent as a stone, but good all the way through. You could do a lot worse." "I know," Margaret said softly. Rebecca nodded once, then walked away, leaving them standing in the middle of the dance floor while the music swirled around them. They left shortly after. Margaret's smile was strained, and William had started fussing, overstimulated by the noise and the people. I walked them to their wagon. "Don't let Briggs get under your skin," I told Miles. "He's all bluster." But Miles's face was grim. "Is he right? About the council?" I couldn't lie to him. He might push for a review. "And the law out here is flexible. If he claims the auction was improper, if he questions the legality of it all, they could take her back." Miles's hands fisted at his sides. "Make her settle the debt some other way." "I won't let that happen," I said. But even as I said it, I wondered what power I really had. Sheriff or not, the law was a tricky thing in the territories. Men like Briggs could twist it to their purposes if they tried hard enough. Margaret sat in the wagon holding William, her face unreadable. Miles climbed up beside her. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought you. Shouldn't have exposed you to—" "Don't!" Margaret's voice was sharp. "Don't apologize for giving me a few hours of feeling normal again, of dancing and talking to people like I'm a person instead of a scandal." She looked at him, and I saw the fire in her eyes that had helped her survive the auction block. "But we need to talk, Miles, when we get home. About what this really is, about what happens next." Miles nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They drove off into the gathering dusk, and I stood there watching them go, a bad feeling settling in my gut. The other boot was about to drop. I could feel it. What happened next, I heard from both of them, separately and together, over the months and years that followed. They rode home in silence, the wagon wheels creaking, the evening birds calling from the pines. William had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder, worn out by the day's excitement. When they reached the ranch, Miles unhitched the mare and led her to the barn. Margaret took William inside and put him to bed, still in his good clothes, too tired to fuss with changing him. When she came back out, Miles was standing by the creek, staring at the water like it held answers. Margaret walked down to stand beside him. "I'm going to leave," she said quietly. Miles's head snapped around. "What?" "Tonight. Tomorrow morning, maybe. But soon." Her voice was calm, too calm. "I won't have you ruined because of me. Won't have the whole town talking about you like you've done something wrong when all you did was help. Margaret, no, listen." She turned to face him. "You've been kind, more than kind. You've given us a home, safety, a chance to breathe. But Briggs is right about one thing. This can't continue as it is. People will talk. They'll make assumptions. And eventually, the law will get involved, and then what?" Miles was shaking his head. "Where would you go? Back to Redemption Creek? To Turner?" "I don't know. East, maybe. I have a cousin in St. Louis who might take you in. Might not." Miles's voice was rough. "Margaret, you have nothing. No money, no prospects, a baby to feed. What kind of life would that be?" "My life," she said fiercely. "My choice. I won't be a burden anymore, Miles. Won't be the cause of your trouble." "You're not a burden. Then what am I?" The question hung between them. Miles opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're—" He stopped, started over. "Stay, please. We'll figure something out. We'll what? Pretend forever that this is just a temporary arrangement? That I'm just passing through?" Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I can't live like that, Miles, in limbo, not knowing what I am to you, not knowing what comes next." "Then marry me." The words came out before Miles could stop them, before he could think about what he was saying, what he was offering. Margaret stared at him. "What?" "Marry me," he said again, more certain now. "That would solve it, wouldn't it? Make it legal, proper, everything Briggs wants. You'd have protection. William would have a name. And we'd what? Margaret's voice was sharp. We'd live as man and wife because the law says so, because it's convenient? That's not what Isn't it? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I was married to one man who didn't really want me, Miles, who loved his whiskey and his cards more than he loved me or his son. I won't do that again. I won't marry for convenience or duty or whatever this is. It's not duty. Miles stepped closer. Margaret, Don't. She held up a hand. Don't say something you don't mean just because you think it's what I need to hear. They stood there in the darkness, the creek murmuring between them, everything that needed to be said caught in their throats. Finally, Miles spoke. Stay, just for tonight. We don't have to decide anything now. Just don't leave in the dark. Promise me that. Margaret nodded slowly. One more night. Then we talk, honestly, about all of it. She walked back to the cabin, her spine straight, her head high. Miles stayed by the creek until the stars came out, trying to figure out when exactly he'd fallen in love with Patrick Flynn's widow and what the hell he was going to do about it. The next morning, I rode out to the ranch with news I'd been dreading to deliver. Briggs had made good on his threat. He'd filed a complaint with the territorial court, claiming the auction had been improper, that Miles had no legal right to take custody of Margaret and William, that the matter needed to be reviewed, and until it was reviewed, Margaret and William were to remain in Whitefish Creek under the court's protection while the case was being heard. I arrived just after dawn, found Miles chopping wood like he was trying to kill it, each swing of the axe landing with a fury that spoke of a sleepless night. Tom, he said, setting down the axe when he saw my face. What's wrong? I told him. Watched his expression go from shock to rage to something colder and more dangerous. How long? He asked. The hearing is in 30 days. Until then, technically, Margaret's status is unclear. Unclear. He said the word like it tasted of poison. They're saying she might still belong to Turner. I'm saying the law is complicated, and Briggs is using that complication to make trouble. I hesitated. There's a way around it, Miles. I know. Marriage. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I asked her last night. She said no. That surprised me. She said no? Said she won't marry for convenience, won't be tied to another man who doesn't really want her. And do you? Really want her? Miles looked at me, and I saw the truth naked in his eyes. More than I've wanted anything in 10 years, he said quietly. But she doesn't believe it. Thinks I'm just being noble. Then make her believe it. Before Miles could respond, Margaret appeared in the cabin doorway, William on her hip. Sheriff Dawson, she said. I thought I heard voices. I told her what I'd told Miles. Watched the color drain from her face. 30 days, she repeated. And if they rule against Miles? Then you'd be remanded back to Turner's custody until the debt is properly settled. Over my dead body, Miles said. Margaret's eyes met his. That might be what it comes to, Miles. And I won't have your blood on my conscience along with Patrick's debts. Patrick's debts aren't your fault, aren't they? Her voice broke. I knew he was gambling, knew he was drinking, and I did nothing, said nothing. Just kept hoping he'd stop, that he'd remember he had a family. She sank onto the porch step, William clutching at her dress. I need to tell you something, she said. Both of you. Something I should have said from the beginning. Miles and I exchanged glances. I had a feeling I knew what was coming, had suspected it since that first moment at the auction when I'd seen her face when Miles said his name. I knew who you were, Margaret said, looking at Miles. At the auction, when you said your name, I knew. Miles went very still. How? Patrick told me. Margaret's voice was steady now, like she'd decided to stop running from the truth. 3 months ago, when the fever had him, when he knew he was dying. She closed her eyes, remembering. He was delirious most of the time, talking about the war, about battles I'd never heard of. But then, toward the end, he grabbed my hand, looked at me with clear eyes for the first time in days. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. He said, If something happens to me, if things go bad, find Miles Sutton. He's in Montana. Best man I ever knew. He'll help you. Promise me, Margaret. Promise me you'll find him." Miles's face had gone white. "I promised," Margaret continued, "even though I didn't understand, even though it seemed like fever talk. But after he died, when Turner came with his papers and his debts, when I realized everything was gone, I remembered." She finally looked at Miles. "I tried to find you, asked around Redemption Creek if anyone knew a Miles Sutton, but no one did. And then the auction was set, and I thought it was over. That Patrick's last wish was just another broken promise." Tears were streaming down her face now. "And then you rode up, said your name, and I knew. I knew Patrick had sent you somehow, that even dead he was trying to protect us. Why didn't you tell me?" Miles's voice was rough. "Because I was afraid." Margaret stood, facing him. "Afraid you'd think I was using you, that I'd sought you out deliberately, manipulated you into helping. I needed to know if what you felt was real. If you were helping because of Patrick or because of me." "It was both," Miles said. "It started as Patrick, but Margaret—" He stopped, took a breath, started again. "I fell in love with you somewhere between Redemption Creek and here. Watching you be brave when you had every reason to break, watching you with William, listening to you laugh at something foolish I said. It stopped being about Patrick weeks ago." Margaret made a sound like a sob. "How can I believe that? How can I trust that it's not just—" "Because I'm telling you the truth." Miles closed the distance between them. "I loved Patrick like a brother, but I'm in love with you. And if you can't see the difference, then I don't know what else to say." I cleared my throat. "I'm going to check on my horse, give you two some privacy." I walked away, giving them space to work through what needed working through. Behind me, I heard Margaret say, "Patrick wrote you a letter. Before he died. I found it in his things." "What?" "A letter. He never sent it. But it's addressed to you. I didn't open it. It didn't seem— I wasn't ready to read it." "Where is it?" "In my room. In the trunk." I was halfway to my horse when I heard Miles say, "Show me." The letter was in a sealed envelope, addressed in Patrick Flynn's distinctive scrawl, "Miles Sutton, Montana Territory." Margaret handed it to Miles with trembling fingers. He stood in the small bedroom holding it like it might explode. Finally, he broke the seal. The handwriting was shaky, the words wandering across the page in the way of a man fighting fever and time. But the message was clear. "Miles, old friend, I'm dying. Doc says it's just fever, but I know better. The drinking, the gambling, I've ruined everything good in my life. Margaret doesn't know how bad the debts are, doesn't know Turner will come for everything we have the moment I'm gone. If you ever get this letter, please find her. She's proud, won't ask for help. But she'll need someone when I'm gone. You're the best man I know, Miles, the only man I'd trust with my family. I never thanked you for Chickamauga, for dragging me back when I should have died, for giving me 3 more years than I deserved. But I thank you now, and I'm asking one more thing. Keep my family safe. Tell Margaret I'm sorry for the man I became, sorry I wasn't strong enough to beat the demons, but tell her I loved her. Loved William. Even when the whiskey and the cards had me, I loved them. You're a better man than I ever was. Don't waste it the way I did." Your friend Patrick Flynn Miles read it twice, then a third time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "He knew," Miles said hoarsely. "He knew I'd come." "He trusted you," Margaret said. "Even at the end, when he couldn't trust himself, he trusted you." Miles folded the letter carefully, then handed it back to Margaret. "Keep it," he said, "for William, so he knows his father loved him, that Patrick tried in his own way to protect you both." Margaret took the letter, then did something that surprised them both. She kissed him, not gentle, not tentative, but fierce and desperate and full of all the things she couldn't say with words. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she said, "I believe you. About loving me. I don't know if I should, but I do. Margaret, but I won't marry you because the law says I should. Won't marry you to solve a legal problem." She cupped his face in her hands. "If we do this, it has to be real. It has to be because we both want it, not because Briggs or Turner or anyone else is forcing our hand." "I want it," Miles said. "I want you. I want William. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here. Want to teach your son to ride and rope and read the weather. Want to grow old with you on this ranch." "Then ask me again," Margaret whispered. "Ask me when it's not about duty or debt or legal complications. Ask me when it's just us." Miles nodded slowly. "I will. But first we have to deal with Briggs and Turner. Because they're not going to stop, Margaret. Not until they've taken everything." "Then we fight," she said simply. "Together." I came back to find them standing close, hands clasped, looking like two people who'd finally stopped running from what they felt. "I take it you've worked things out?" I asked. "For now," Miles said. He looked at me. "Tom, I need your help. Legal help. How do we fight this?" I'd been thinking about that very question all night. "Marriage is the simplest solution," I said. "But there's another way. I could petition the territorial governor, claim the auction was conducted under false pretenses, that Turner knowingly misrepresented the debt amount to manipulate the proceedings. Would that work? Maybe, if I can prove it." I pulled a folded paper from my pocket. "I've been doing some digging. Turner's not as clean as he pretends. There are other people he's ruined, other debts he's manipulated. If I can find them, get them to testify." "That takes time," Margaret said. "Time we might not have." 30 days, I agreed. "It's not much, but it's what we've got." Miles's jaw set devout in that stubborn line I was learning to recognize. "Then we use every one of those 30 days, he said. "We find the evidence, we build the case, and we make damn sure that when that hearing comes, there's no question about where Margaret and William belong." He looked at Margaret. "If you'll stay, if you'll trust me that long." She smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from her since the auction. "I'll stay," she said. "We'll stay." I left them there, standing together on that ranch, facing down a threat that hadn't fully materialized yet, but hung over them like a storm waiting to break. I had work to do, people to find, evidence to gather, a case to build against a man who'd been playing with other people's lives for too long. But as I rode back toward Whitefish Creek, I allowed myself a moment of hope, because I'd seen something in Miles and Margaret that I hadn't seen in a long time. Something that went deeper than passion or convenience or even love, though it was all of those things. I'd seen partnership, two people who'd looked at their circumstances and decided to fight instead of flee, who'd chosen honesty over easy lies, who'd decided that what they were building together was worth protecting. The next few weeks would test that decision, would test them both, but I believed they'd hold, had to believe it. Because if they didn't, if Turner and Briggs succeeded in tearing apart what Miles and Margaret were building, then what hope was there for any of us? What hope for justice in a place where the law could be twisted to serve greed and spite? What hope for love in a world that seemed determined to crush it before it could take root? I didn't have answers, not yet. But I had 30 days to find them, and I wasn't going to waste a single one. Those 30 days passed faster than any month I'd lived through. I rode circuits between Whitefish Creek and every mining camp, every settlement, every dusty crossroads in the territory, looking for people Turner had wronged. Finding them wasn't hard. The man had left a trail of ruined lives stretching back to his army days. Getting them to testify was harder. Fear has a way of keeping people quiet, but I found 3 who'd talk. A widow whose farm Turner had seized on trumped-up debt, a miner he'd cheated out of a claim, and a former Army quartermaster who'd witnessed Turner selling government supplies in '64. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Meanwhile, Miles and Margaret waited. They worked the ranch together, building something that looked more like a partnership every day, and they watched the road, knowing Turner wouldn't let the hearing be his only move. They were right. On the 28th day, Turner made his play. It was Margaret who heard the horses first. She'd been hanging wash in the yard, William playing at her feet with wooden blocks Miles had carved for him. The afternoon was warm, peaceful, the kind of day that makes you forget danger exists. Then she heard hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast. She scooped up William and ran for the cabin. "Miles!" He was already coming through the door, rifle in hand. He'd heard them too. "Get inside, bar the door." "Miles, do it, now." Margaret ran inside with William. Miles heard the bar drop into place behind her. 6 riders came into the yard, Turner in the lead, dressed fine as always. Big Jack beside him, grinning. 4 others Miles didn't recognize, hired guns from the look of them. Miles stood on his porch, rifle lowered but ready. "You're on my land, Turner. State your business or get off." Turner smiled that oily smile. "Just here to collect what's mine, Sutton. Court hearings in 2 days. Thought I'd save everyone the trouble and take Mrs. Flynn back to town now. Put her somewhere safe until the matter's settled." "She is somewhere safe." "Is she, though?" Turner's eyes went to the cabin windows. "Living in sin with a man she barely knows? I'd call that many things, Sutton. Safe isn't one of them." Big Jack shifted in his saddle. His hand rested on his gun. Miles saw the play forming, 6 against 1. They'd rush him, take Margaret and William while he was trying to fight them off, maybe kill him in the process, claim self-defense. "Margaret Flynn stays here," Miles said quietly. "You want to contest that? You do it in court like a civilized man." "Civilized?" Turner laughed. "Rich, coming from you. Tell me, Sutton, did you ever tell Mrs. Flynn why you really rode to that auction? Did you tell her about our history?" Miles's jaw tightened. "No?" Turner's smile widened. "Shall I tell her? About how you destroyed my career, got me dishonorably discharged over a few harmless transactions?" "You were stealing from the army," Miles said, "selling supplies while soldiers starved. I was conducting business, and you, in your self-righteous fury, reported me, cost me everything." Turner leaned forward. "So when I heard Patrick Flynn had a widow, when I realized she might bring you running, well, it seemed like Providence. A chance to take from you what you took from me." The cabin door opened. Margaret stepped out, William in her arms. "Margaret, get back inside," Miles said, but she walked past him, down the steps, and stood between Miles and Turner's men. "Is that true?" she asked Turner. "You orchestrated that auction knowing Miles would come?" "Oh, the auction was real enough, the debt was real, but the presentation, that was for your friend Sutton's benefit. I wanted him to see you up there. Wanted him to feel obligated." Turner's eyes glittered. "And it worked beautifully. He paid more than the debt was worth. Took you in, made himself vulnerable, and now I'm going to take it all back and watch him break." Margaret's voice was steel. "You're a monster." "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Flynn. Now, if you'll come with us—" "She's not going anywhere." The voice came from the tree line. I rode out, and with me came 15 men, ranchers from the valley, townsmen from Whitefish Creek, Dr. Hartwell and the minister, even Rebecca Wilson's father, the sawmill owner, armed, every one of them. "Tom," Miles breathed. I guided my horse forward until I was between Turner and the cabin. "Silas Turner, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to kidnap." Turner's face went purple. "You have no authority. I have all the authority I need." I pulled out the papers I'd been carrying for 2 days, signed by the territorial governor himself. "Seems he was very interested in your business practices once I laid out the evidence." Big Jack's hand moved toward his gun. "I wouldn't," said the sawmill owner. He had a shotgun trained on Jack. So did 3 other men. The hired guns looked at each other. These were men who fought for money, not conviction. They weren't dying for Turner's grudge. One by one they raised their hands. We arrested them all, took them back to Whitefish Creek, and locked them in the jail I'd been sheriff of for 6 years. Turner screamed about his rights, about corruption, about how this wasn't legal. But I'd followed the law to the letter this time. Had the evidence, had the warrant, had everything proper and documented. The territorial court agreed. Within a week, Turner was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to 10 years, though he'd only served 5 before his heart gave out. Big Jack got 3 years for assault and attempted kidnapping. The others scattered after posting bail, and I never saw them again. The case against Miles was dismissed with prejudice. Margaret and William were declared free and clear of all debts. It was over. But the story, the real story, was just beginning. I rode out to the ranch a week after the arrest, found Miles on the porch, whittling. He'd gotten good at making toys for William, horses, cattle, little wagons with wheels that turned. "Tom," he said, standing, "come for supper? If Margaret's cooking, I won't say no." She was. We ate venison stew and fresh bread with wild berry pie after. William sat in a high chair Miles had built, throwing more food than he ate, but laughing the whole time. After we'd eaten and Margaret had put the boy to bed, the three of us sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "I owe you," Miles said, "more than I can repay." "You don't owe me anything. I did my job." "You did more than that. You chose justice over law when the two didn't match." I nodded. It was true. I'd bent rules, called in favors, pushed the boundaries of what a small-town sheriff should be able to do. But I'd sleep sound anyway. "What will you do now?" I asked them. Miles and Margaret looked at each other. Something passed between them, some understanding they didn't need words for. "We'll stay," Margaret said. "Build the ranch. Raise William, see what comes." "And us?" Miles asked her. "What about us?" She smiled. "Ask me again, proper this time, not because of courts or threats, not because you owe Patrick or I need saving." Miles set down his whittling knife, got up, walked over to where Margaret sat, and there, under the Montana stars, he knelt down on one knee. "Margaret Flynn," he said, "I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you sing to William when you think no one's listening. I love how you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" She was crying. "Yes, yes, Miles Sutton, I'll marry you." He slipped a ring on her finger, his mother's ring, gold with a small diamond. He'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. They kissed, and I looked away, giving them privacy. When I looked back, they were holding each other like they'd never let go. "I'll perform the ceremony," I offered. "Territorial law lets sheriffs marry folks, if you'll have me." "We'd be honored," Miles said. They married 3 weeks later. Small ceremony in the yard, with the whole valley in attendance. Margaret wore a dress Mrs. Caldwell had sewn, white with blue trim. Miles wore his best shirt, boots polished until they shone. I spoke the words, and they spoke their vows. Simple promises, honestly made. When I pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could have been heard in Redemption Creek. The celebration lasted until sunset. Food and music and dancing. William learning to clap in time with the fiddle. Rebecca Wilson toasting the bride and groom with genuine happiness. As the sun set and people started heading home, I found Miles and Margaret standing by the creek, watching the water catch the last light. "Happy?" I asked. "More than I knew I could be," Miles said. Margaret leaned into him. "Thank you, Tom, for everything. Just doing what's right." "No," she said firmly. "You did more than that. You restored my faith that good people exist in this world, that justice is possible even out here." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just tipped my hat and walked away, letting them have their moment. The young journalist across from me set down his pencil. We'd been talking for hours, the sun having set while I told the story. "And they lived happily ever after?" he asked. I poured us both another whiskey. "They lived. That's close enough." "What do you mean?" "I mean life isn't a fairy tale. Miles still had nightmares some nights. Margaret still grieved for Patrick, for the man he'd been before the war broke him. They had hard winters and thin years and all the struggles any ranch family faces." I sipped my whiskey. "But they had each other, and they built something real, something lasting." "Children?" 3 more after William, 2 girls and a boy. The ranch prospered. William grew up strong and decent, became a rancher himself. Last I heard, he's running the place now. Miles and Margaret are in their 60s, still there, still together. The journalist smiled. "So it was a happy ending." "It was a real ending," I corrected, "which is better than happy. Real lasts." I stood, walked to the window. Outside, Whitefish Creek was settling into evening, lamplight in windows, smoke from chimneys, the sound of a child laughing somewhere down the street. "You know what I learned from watching them?" I said. "That redemption isn't something you earn with one grand gesture. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice." Miles didn't save Margaret that day at the auction. They saved each other, slowly, over time, through honesty and hard work and refusing to give up. I turned back to face him. That's the real story, not the auction or the standoff or any of the dramatic bits. The real story is what came after, two broken people deciding they were stronger together than apart. The journalist finished his drink. "That's a hell of a story, Sheriff." "It is, and it's true, every word." He gathered his things, preparing to leave. At the door he paused. "Do you ever regret it? Bending the law the way you did?" I thought about that, about the choices I'd made, the rules I'd bent, the line I'd walked between justice and legality. "No," I said finally, "I don't. Because I learned something important that summer. The law is supposed to serve people, not the other way around. And when it stops serving, when it starts protecting men like Turner while punishing people like Miles and Margaret, well, that's when good people have to make hard choices." He nodded. "Thank you for the story." After he left, I sat in my chair and looked at my old badge on the desk. I never did regret it. Still don't. Because some things matter more than rules, things like honor and love and the courage to stand up when it would be easier to look away. Miles Sutton understood that. So did Margaret. And in the end, that understanding built them a life worth living. Out my window, the evening star appeared. The same star that had been rising that night in 1878 when everything changed. I raised my glass to it, to them, to the choices we make and the redemption we find. And I smiled because sometimes, just sometimes, the story has an ending worth telling, even if it's not the fairy tale people expect. It's better. It's real, and real is what lasts.